On a wind-cutting morning in December of 1887, the wealthiest man in Hollowvale, a booming mining town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, descended the polished staircase of his mansion and froze. There, on the tiled floor of the main hall, lay his wife's indigo silk robe, delicately folded, still warm to the touch. The scent of her rosewater perfume lingered like a ghost. But Lillian Harrow was gone. The doors had been bolted from the inside. Every window was latched. Not a sound had disturbed the night, at least not according to the house's 10 trusted staff. No broken glass, no footprints in the morning frost, no sign of entry or escape. Only her robe, warm, recent. Even more chilling was that 3 staff members had seen her, wearing that exact robe, just hours earlier, ascending the stairs with a candle and retiring to her suite. Now, nothing. Her slippers remained by the bed. Her hairbrush was still tangled with auburn strands, and yet the lady of Hollowvale was gone, as if erased. The Hollowvale Constabulary, under quiet pressure from Lillian Harrow's many benefactors, closed the investigation after just 5 days. No signs of foul play, they said. Likely a tragic flight, perhaps a suicide. But they didn't know what Gideon did, or what he suspected. Behind closed doors, Lillian Harrow, a man whose fortune stemmed from a series of mysterious acquisitions and conveniently timed mine collapses, had long feared this day. Lillian had been growing distant, curious, secretive. He had caught her in his study late at night, reading through contracts she should never have seen. Her journals vanished and reappeared. Servants whispered about strange men visiting after dusk. What the authorities couldn't have known, what they didn't care to know, was that Lillian Harrow hadn't simply vanished. Her disappearance was the culmination of a slow-burning fuse that had been lit 2 years earlier, a reckoning long in the making. She had discovered too much, about the mines, about the accidents, about Gideon. This was no crime of passion. It was a chess move, a warning, a cover-up, one carefully orchestrated by a man who had built his fortune on buried truths and was now willing to bury one more, even if that truth wore his wedding ring. In Hollowvale, the Harrow estate stood apart, not just in wealth, but in elevation. Built on a ridge that loomed over the fog-choked valley below, the mansion was as much fortress as residence. Locals called it Highpoint, a nod to its perch above the soot-stained rooftops of the mining district. It was said you could see the entire county from the eastern balcony. Lillian Harrow liked that. He liked seeing everything. Highpoint was a monstrous structure, 4 stories of stone imported from Scotland, its facade darkened by decades of coal smoke and acid rain. Wrought iron gargoyles leered from the eaves. Leaded glass windows filtered the light into cold, distorted shapes. At night, the flicker of gas lamps made the place feel alive, as if the house itself were breathing, watching. It had been built in 1879, 2 years after Gideon struck a vein of anthracite deep beneath Black Hollow Mine. That vein had made him rich. It had also claimed 17 men in a collapse no one dared to investigate too closely. After the bodies were buried, Gideon commissioned the estate, complete with a sprawling carriage house, 2 greenhouses, and an ice house carved into the hillside. That building, chilled year-round by underground spring water, would later become a subject of deep suspicion. Inside, the house was a masterwork of calculated grandeur, marble floors inlaid with obsidian, chandeliers from Italy, French wallpaper in hues too pale to survive Hollowvale's dust for long. The ballroom alone could hold 200 guests, though in recent years fewer parties were held. Lillian, once the belle of every event, had grown reclusive. She was rarely seen outside the property. Her letters to friends in Boston became shorter, then stopped entirely. The housekeeper said she wandered the halls at night, murmuring to herself, clutching a silver locket she never removed. And she had taken a peculiar interest in the library, a chamber of high windows and older secrets. Lillian had started collecting books about industrial sabotage, mining accidents, labor revolts, the deaths of certain whistleblowers. She read them obsessively, taking notes in a leather-bound journal she kept locked in a drawer. The key, servants noted, hung from a chain around her neck. A month before her disappearance, she had quietly ordered maps, detailed layouts of Hollowvale's mines and tunnels. They were never meant to reach a lady's hands, but they did, and Highpoint's cold stone walls absorbed everything in silence. Because nothing screamed in Highpoint. Not anymore. When Lillian Marwood married Gideon Harrow in the summer of 1882, the newspapers called it the union of coal and capital. She was the last daughter of a proud old family from Providence, Rhode Island. Bankers, judges, landowners. He was the son of a failed preacher, risen through grit and blood from the shaft floors of the Hollowvale mines. Their wedding was a spectacle, a fusion of aristocracy and new money. Lillian had been 23, Gideon was 45. He courted her with letters first, strikingly articulate for a man of such origins. Then came gifts, jewelry, first editions, rare flowers grown in heated boxes. Her mother had warned her. Men like Harrow didn't climb that high without stepping on someone's throat. But Lillian, idealistic and unseasoned, believed otherwise. She believed in his vision. Safer mines, fair wages, dignity for laborers. Gideon spoke of reforms, of innovation, of building a legacy, not just of wealth, but of improvement. The truth, of course, was more complicated. By the time they wed, Gideon Harrow already controlled over a dozen mines and 3 rail lines. His competitors had fallen, some bankrupt, others buried. His lawyers were feared, his bribes well-placed. A pattern of suspicious disasters followed wherever his bids were blocked. But none of this reached the Providence newspapers. Lillian came west with stars in her eyes. The first year of marriage was public joy. Balls, dinners, tours of the estate. She was beautiful, educated, fluent in French, fond of poetry. The miners' wives adored her. So did their children. She opened a schoolhouse on the edge of town and funded a charity for injured workers. But as the months turned to years, cracks appeared. Lillian grew wary of Gideon's late-night meetings. She stopped attending galas. The warmth between them cooled into polite silence. By 1886, they were more housemates than husband and wife, passing each other like ghosts in the manor's long halls. It wasn't until Lillian began requesting ledgers from the mine offices that the balance shifted. Gideon indulged her at first. Let her play at business, he told his clerk. But she wasn't playing. She was cross-referencing dates of fatalities with company takeovers, tracking shifts in ownership, calculating. One night, she asked him, quite calmly, what really happened at Gethsemane Pit. Gideon didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough to chill the room. From that moment on, he knew Lillian wasn't just watching. She was digging. Highpoint was no ordinary household, and its staff no ordinary servants. Every gardener, cook, and chambermaid had been vetted, some through discreet letters to Boston, others through back channels in Charleston and Richmond. Discretion was valued above all else, but even in a house built on silence, some things couldn't be buried. Margaret Rowley, the housekeeper, had served the Harrow family for nearly a decade. Stern, meticulous, and loyal beyond question, at least until she began noticing Lillian's sudden changes. The mistress had grown thinner, quieter, always clutching that silver locket and slipping off at strange hours. More than once, Margaret found mud-caked boots near the back door, and once, a smudge of coal dust on Lillian's cloak. Then there was Elias Baines, the estate's groundskeeper. A veteran of the Union Army and no stranger to violence, Elias knew when something wasn't right. He swore to his dying day that in the weeks before Lillian vanished, he saw lights in the ice house, faint and flickering, far past midnight. No one was supposed to enter that building anymore. The last use it had seen was before the electric refrigeration was installed in '85. And yet, someone had been there. Lillian, he believed. One night, while walking the dog along the southern wall, Elias had seen her silhouette slipping from the conservatory, cloak drawn tight, carrying a lantern. She didn't see him. She moved quickly, with purpose, vanishing toward the hill. Downstairs, Charles Pendle, the butler, had his own suspicions. He never liked Gideon, too watchful, too controlling. Pendle had once managed the affairs of a diplomat in London, and in his view, Harrow's brand of civility was a skin stretched over something primal. He'd overheard arguments, not loud, but sharp. Lillian's voice, quiet but firm. Gideon's, low and deliberate, more like negotiation than anger. Something had shifted in their dynamic. Lillian no longer asked permission. She gave instructions. Her confidence had returned. But confidence was dangerous in a house like this. Most chilling of all was what Margaret found 2 nights before Lillian disappeared. The lady's journal left unlocked on the writing desk by accident, or perhaps deliberately. Margaret read only 1 page, enough to see names, dates, accidents, and a single sentence written in Lillian's delicate hand. They didn't die. They were removed. After that, Margaret never entered the East Wing without crossing herself. December 11th, 1887. It was a Sunday night, bitterly cold, the sky over Hollowvale thick with a ceiling of gray that held back a coming snow. Inside Highpoint, the rooms glowed with gaslight and the faint warmth of coal stoves. Dinner was served at precisely 7, roast duck, stewed apples, and a dark claret from Gideon's personal stock. Margaret Rowley recalled that Lillian barely touched her plate. She was dressed more elegantly than usual, an emerald gown cinched tightly at the waist, with a brooch shaped like a raven pinned at her collar. Her auburn hair was pinned in loose curls, and she wore a hint of rouge, something she had not done in months. The servants exchanged glances. Gideon, by contrast, seemed animated, speaking about expansion projects near the Ohio River, but he checked his pocket watch 3 times during the meal. At 9:15, Margaret helped Lillian prepare for bed. The gown stayed on. "I won't sleep yet," Lillian said gently. "Just thinking tonight." She stood before the mirror, touching the locket at her throat. Margaret noticed a small cut on her wrist, just beneath the bracelet. When asked, Lillian only replied, "It was nothing." Margaret would later remember that moment, the smile Lillian gave her. It wasn't fearful or sad. It was resolved, a woman who had already made her decision. Before leaving, Margaret turned down the covers, then paused at the doorway. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Harrow?" Lillian looked over her shoulder. "If something happens," she said, "please remember I always believed someone would listen. Eventually." At 11 o'clock, Elias Baines, making his final patrol of the grounds, spotted a light in the eastern study. He raised his lantern and saw her silhouette through the frosted glass, seated, writing with urgency. He noted her movements were fast, almost frantic. It wasn't letter writing. It was confession, record-keeping, evidence. By dawn, the light had vanished. So had Lillian. The front door remained bolted from the inside, the windows unbroken. No horses disturbed, no footsteps in the snow. Only the emerald gown, laid out with eerie care on the Persian rug, still warm to the touch, as if she had stepped out of it only moments before, and beside it, folded neatly, her wedding ring, but not the locket. That was gone. To the casual visitor, the Harrow Estate's ice house was a forgotten relic, built before electricity, before Gideon installed chilled pantries and mechanical coolers. It stood halfway down the slope behind the estate, a stone structure built into the earth, fronted by a rusted iron door. By 1887, it was sealed shut and declared unstable, at least officially. Elias Baines had long suspected otherwise. He'd seen tracks, narrow and deliberate, leading through the snow to the door. Once, he found the lock dusted with fresh fingerprints. Another time, he spotted condensation on the metal latch, even though the building had supposedly remained closed for years. On the morning of Lillian's disappearance, Elias went straight to the ice house. What he found chilled him. Dark stains in the snow, just outside the threshold. Not mud, something thicker. Blood, he thought, faint but present. He fetched Pendle and Margaret. They approached the building together, but before Elias could pry open the door, Gideon Harrow appeared. "No one is to go inside," Gideon said, calm, commanding. "The structure is unstable. A collapse could kill someone." Elias stepped forward, shovel in hand. "Then I'll take that risk." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You'll do as you're told." And just like that, the ice house was declared off limits. Later that day, Gideon summoned workers, stonemasons, brought in from the northern quarries. By dusk, fresh mortar sealed the doorway shut, bricks laid over the frame. No explanation was given, no questions were allowed. That same night, Margaret went to clean Lillian's study. She found the fire cold and the curtains drawn. The writing desk, locked tight, but on the table someone had left a page, torn from a journal. 4 words, written in that familiar hand. "The truth must survive." Elsewhere in the room, the scent of lavender oil still hung in the air. But beneath it, something sharper, a chemical note, like ether or chloroform. Margaret's stomach turned. Meanwhile, Gideon issued strange orders. He asked Pendle to gather all of Lillian's correspondence, all journals, all receipts. "For safekeeping," he said, but his voice betrayed urgency, not grief. What disturbed the staff most wasn't the loss of their mistress, it was their master's reaction. Gideon did not cry, he did not shout. He simply stared at the place where the gown had been, pale and still, as if watching something inevitable unfold. Like a man reading the last line of a story he already knew. Dr. Thaddeus Gray had been the Harrow family physician for 6 years. Educated in Philadelphia, well-mannered and discreet, he was often summoned to Highpoint to treat Gideon's migraines or Lillian's chronic fatigue. He kept meticulous notes, some of which would later disappear from his ledger entirely. In the weeks leading up to Lillian's disappearance, those notes had grown more troubling. He had recorded signs of acute stress in her, tremors in her hands, sleeplessness, shortness of breath. But most unusual were the bruises, small, circular, appearing on her wrists and collarbones. When asked, Lillian offered no explanation. Instead, she changed the subject. Dr. Gray noted her pulse as erratic, frightened, her gaze searching corners of the room when no one was there. He suspected opiate withdrawal or a mental break, but Lillian was lucid, too lucid. She asked questions about chemicals used in anesthesia. She wanted to know what dosage would render someone unconscious, but not dead. When Dr. Gray asked why she was interested, she replied softly, I'm trying to understand the tools my husband prefers. On the morning of her disappearance, Gideon summoned him before breakfast. The doctor arrived to find Gideon dressed, calm, seated in the study. No mention was made of Lillian until the door was locked and the curtains drawn. "My wife is missing," Gideon said. "I want you to write a statement confirming she was mentally unstable, paranoid, possibly suicidal." Dr. Gray refused. Gideon placed a leather satchel on the desk. "Inside is a deed to a parcel of land in South Carolina. It's yours, provided your report says what's required." The doctor left an hour later, his face pale, his lips tight. He told Margaret not to ask questions, then rode directly back to town. His medical notes for that week disappeared. So did all official copies of Lillian's prior treatments. Days later, Hollowvale's sheriff declared there was no evidence of a crime. Dr. Gray never visited Highpoint again. Years later, during a private conversation with Elias Baines, the doctor would confess. She knew what was coming. She said it wasn't just about Gideon, that he was part of something older, something vast. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to leave a trail. But the trail had begun to vanish, one record at a time. And Highpoint, as always, kept its secrets close. By the time Margaret Rowley realized what Gideon was truly after, it was already too late. He had asked for all of Lillian's papers, her letters, her notes, her ledger books. Margaret complied at first, handing over receipts, calling cards, even torn envelopes. But one item she kept hidden: a leather-bound journal, small and dark red, with a brass clasp. It had been tucked beneath Lillian's mattress, wrapped in linen. She hadn't meant to find it. She was changing the sheets when she heard the hollow knock of wood on wood. Curious, she reached beneath the frame and drew it out. The weight of it made her breath catch. Inside were pages written in Lillian's careful hand, notes about mining disasters, names of workers, newspaper clippings pasted to the pages, some describing collapses, others silent obituaries for whistleblowers who had fallen ill or vanished during a snowstorm. It was clear Lillian had been keeping records, cross-referencing deaths with company takeovers, tracing accidents to acquisitions. The name Gideon Harrow appeared more than once, but never alone. He was part of a list. On one page was a heading in block letters: the Ridgeline Trust. Below it, a dozen names: mine owners, rail barons, judges, even a senator. Next to each, annotations in ink. Owns 34% of East Hollowvale, suspected bribes to regulators. Linked to safety review 6 days before August Kala. Shares passed through 4 shell companies before purchase. The pattern was unmistakable and chilling. At the bottom of the page, one line stood alone: not accidents, coordinated, profitable. Margaret knew then why Lillian had been wearing that locket constantly. It wasn't sentimental. It was a key. That night, Margaret returned to the study. Quiet, careful. She checked the writing desk drawer, the one Lillian always kept locked. It opened with the locket's tiny brass key. Inside was an envelope. It contained 2 things: a map of the Harrow estate and a folded note. If I vanish, follow the corridor behind the library hearth. The icehouse entrance is safer. Check for the red ribbon. It marks the vault. Burn this. Margaret did not burn it. Instead, she returned the journal to its hiding place. But by morning, the mattress had been stripped. The journal gone. She hadn't told anyone where it was, not a soul, which meant someone else already knew. Sheriff Amos Tiller of Hollowvale was known as a reasonable man, veteran of the war, twice elected, fond of tobacco and order. But when summoned to Highpoint on the morning of December 12, 1887, he moved with an unease that hadn't touched him since Gettysburg. He arrived shortly after dawn. The snow still fell in soft, slow flakes. Lillian was already being spoken of in the past tense. "She must have wandered into the cold," Gideon said. "She hadn't been well." Sheriff Tiller examined the foyer, the neatly folded gown, the wedding ring, the page with its cryptic message. The truth must survive. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no exit, no footprints. The windows were latched from the inside, the door bolted. It was a sealed room mystery. Too sealed. Tiller asked questions. Margaret answered as plainly as she dared. Charles Pendle mentioned the odd behavior, Gideon's calmness, his refusal to call authorities until hours after sunrise. Elias Baines mentioned the ice house. That was when Gideon's mood shifted. "The ice house is off limits," he said. "Unsafe. Has been for years." But when the sheriff approached it later that afternoon, he found it newly bricked shut, the mortar still wet. That night, the Masons were seen drinking in town, flush with coin. The job had been rushed, paid in full. Still, Tiller wasn't yet ready to accuse a man like Lillian Harrow. Not openly. Instead, he made inquiries. Quiet ones. He asked about Lillian's background, her family's financial collapse in Rhode Island, her father's death, labeled a suicide but surrounded by rumors of foul play, her brother who'd vanished 2 years prior on a supposed trip west. And everywhere he looked, the same whispers surfaced. A powerful group of men who operated in the shadows of the mining boom. Names tied to mysterious deaths, failed companies, and thriving successors. Always the same few beneficiaries. Always the same silence. Tiller returned to Highpoint 4 days later with a writ to inspect the ice house. He found the brickwork reinforced and a formal notice from the county engineer declaring it condemned. When he asked who had filed the paperwork, he was told it came directly from the mayor's office. And so, on the 6th day, the investigation into Lillian Harrow's disappearance was officially closed. The report read, "No evidence of wrongdoing, presumed mental breakdown, case resolved." But Sheriff Tiller didn't sleep well that night. He never would again. Though the official story closed neatly, not everyone in Hollowvale believed it, least of all Elias Baines. The old groundskeeper had seen too much. Over the years, he'd kept notes, quiet, methodical observations. When the other servants whispered about Lillian's strange habits or Gideon's late-night guests, Elias had already started cataloging dates, faces, even the brands of carriages that arrived by the side road past midnight. After the sheriff's investigation was buried, Elias did something few men in Hollowvale dared. He reached out beyond the town. He wrote to a man named Calvin Roach, a retired Pinkerton agent living in Wheeling. They had served together briefly during the war, and Roach had since made a name for himself rooting out corruption in the coalfields. Elias sent him a letter marked private and urgent with 3 simple lines. She knew. He silenced her. The ice house holds the truth. 2 weeks later, Roach arrived in Hollowvale under the name Mr. Carter, claiming to be an insurance adjuster reviewing estate valuations. He took up a room at the Black Ridge Inn and began quietly interviewing townsfolk, bartenders, teamsters, clerks at the courthouse. The patterns emerged quickly. Harrow's rise coincided with the demise of at least 5 rival families, each downfall linked to a mining accident or a sudden withdrawal of funding. Each time, Gideon or one of his silent partners acquired the assets within weeks, often through shell companies no one had heard of. Roach was careful, but not careful enough. One evening, while walking the perimeter of Highpoint's southern wall, Elias spotted unfamiliar boot prints near the fence. Heavy, military style. The next morning, Roach's room was empty, his bed untouched. The innkeeper said he had left before dawn, but his coat and satchel remained hanging by the door. No one ever saw Calvin Roach again. Later that same week, Margaret found a note wedged beneath a floorboard in Lillian's dressing room. It was unsigned, but written in the same tight script Lillian used in her journal. The ink was faded, but the words were legible. They are watching the watchers now. If you read this, bury what I found, not in the ground, but in the cracks. The mansion itself knows where. She read the note twice, then burned it. But she remembered the final phrase. The mansion itself knows. It was then she began searching the walls, and what she found would change everything. It was nearly midnight when Margaret Rowley crept back into the library. The coals in the fireplace long cold, the gas lamps extinguished. Only her candle lit the room, its trembling flame casting long shadows across the rows of books Gideon never read. She moved to the far wall, the one that always seemed just slightly closer than it should have been. For days, she had been tapping on the oak panels, listening for hollow spots. This one gave a different sound, fainter, less solid. With shaking hands, she pulled on the carved acanthus molding along the side. Nothing happened at first, but then, when she pressed on the center of a rosette at the top corner, click. The panel swung inward. Behind it, darkness. She lit another candle and stepped inside. The passage was narrow, dusty, and cold. It descended sharply, carved into the stone bones of the ridge itself. Margaret's breath became visible in the chill. She walked for several minutes, heart pounding, the stone corridor curving, then branching. Then she saw it, a red ribbon tied to a rusted iron sconce, just like the note had said. She followed it to a door. It wasn't wood, it was steel, riveted, like the hatch of a ship. And it was already open. Inside, the room was square, 10 by 10, lined with shelves, papers, photographs, ledgers, candles long burned down, and in the center, a desk. Upon the desk was a journal, Lillian's. Not the one Margaret had hidden in the mattress. This one was thicker, its pages filled front to back in tight cursive, detailed logs of meetings between mine owners, sketches of estate maps, mine shafts, escape tunnels, lists of victims, and at the very end, the Ridgeline Trust Charter, an unsigned document describing a pact between 7 men to guide the industrial destiny of Appalachia and protect its engines of commerce from interference, internal or external. And below that, Gideon Harrow's name, in bold. Margaret staggered back. Before she could leave, she heard something, a scrape behind her. Footsteps, faint but close. She extinguished her candle and hid behind a shelving unit. The footsteps grew louder, then silence. Then, the door creaked closed, and the latch clicked. Margaret was trapped, and she wasn't alone. Margaret did not scream. The darkness inside the hidden chamber was absolute. The heavy door had sealed behind her with a finality that left no doubt. It had been designed to lock from the outside. A prison, not a passage. She crouched beneath the desk, her hands pressed against the cold stone floor, breath held. For several seconds, nothing. Then, movement. Not footsteps now, but a slow, sliding sound. Something being dragged. Something breathing. Margaret remained still, her fingers brushing the edge of a metal drawer. Inside, she found a small oil lamp and a box of matches. She lit it with trembling hands, shielding the flame with her palm. The glow revealed the room, again, and something else. A shape, slumped in the far corner. Human. She approached cautiously. It was a man, thin, exhausted, maybe half-starved. He sat with his back against the wall, his eyes fluttering. His clothes were ragged, but the fine stitching at the cuffs told her he had once worn wealth. He looked up. "You're not one of them," he whispered. "No," she said. "I'm the housekeeper." He gave a pained smile. "Then you're the first kind face I've seen in a long time." His name was Elijah Marwood, Lillian's brother. Alive. He'd been presumed dead, gone west after their father's scandal. But he'd returned under a false name to help Lillian uncover the Ridgeline Trust. He'd been hiding within the estate for months, using the secret passages, moving only at night. It was Elijah who had met with Lillian in the ice house, who had helped map the Trust's empire, who had warned her the conspiracy was deeper than they had feared. "They found me," he murmured, "but not before we made copies. She hid them, multiple caches. This vault was just one. The rest, I don't even know." Margaret pressed a cup of water to his lips. "The sheriff. We'll go to him." Elijah shook his head. "No use. Tiller's watched. Everyone is. The trust owns this town and half the state beyond it." As the oil in the lamp began to burn low, Margaret asked the question that had haunted her for days. "What happened to Lillian?" Elijah's face tightened. "She made them afraid. That's what happened." Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "She's still here. I don't mean living." He looked toward the wall behind him. "She's behind that stone. They sealed her in." The stone slab Elijah pointed to was embedded in the far wall of the vault, faintly marked with a blackened outline, like a doorway erased. No handle, no hinges, just cold gray stone imperfectly matched to the rest of the chamber. Margaret stepped closer, raising the flickering lamp. At the base of the wall, a line of mortar, newer than the surrounding stone, damp in places. Someone had sealed it recently. Elijah sat in silence as Margaret ran her fingers across the seams. She found a groove at waist height, possibly a former latch, and then her hand caught on something. A scrap of cloth. She pulled gently. It was the corner of a nightgown, green silk. Margaret fell to her knees. "She was trying to escape," Elijah said, voice breaking. "She told me she'd found something deeper than the trust. Not just corruption. Rituals, burials, things buried under the mines before the mines were even dug." He reached for the desk and slid open a drawer Margaret hadn't noticed. Inside was a folded page from Lillian's second journal, preserved in wax paper. The ink had faded, but the words remained. "He dreams in coal. They feed him with souls. The mountain chose him, not the other way around." Margaret stared. "Elijah," she whispered. "What was this really about?" He hesitated. "The trust uses death to grow their power. Not metaphorically. Literally. They bury people alive. Sacrifices. Lillian found records of it. Hidden accounts. A vault beneath the oldest shaft. Far older than any mine. Older than Hollowvale itself. She thought she could stop them," he added. "But Gideon, he made sure she was the last." Margaret turned back to the wall. Her hands trembled, but she kept digging at the seams. Chunks of loose mortar came away. Behind them, wood, a panel. She wedged a metal tool beneath it and pried. The board groaned, then fell inward. The stench hit them instantly. Rot, damp, silk, a faint perfume that lingered like memory. Inside the hidden recess lay the crumpled form of Lillian Harrow. Arms folded, eyes closed, as if merely asleep. And in her hands, clutched to her chest, was the locket. Margaret reached in with shaking fingers. The metal was warm. Margaret didn't speak as she took the locket from Lillian's cold hands. The warmth it held wasn't natural, not in that freezing stone chamber. It pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. Elijah watched her from the corner, his eyes sunken and hollow. She said it contained the final piece, the leverage, the proof. Margaret opened the locket slowly. Inside, there was no photograph. Instead, a tiny rolled slip of vellum, tightly wound, sealed with wax. She broke the seal with her thumbnail and unfurled the message. It was a confession, not Lillian's, but Gideon's. Handwritten, initialed, dated 6 months prior to her disappearance. The contents were chilling. Names of men sacrificed to secure land titles, bribes paid to state officials to falsify death records, and most damning of all, details about the founding of the Ridgeline Trust, how it began not as a business venture, but as a spiritual pact. A covenant made beneath Black Hollow Mine during a night in 1861 when Gideon and 6 others had descended into a collapsed cavern to make offerings to the earth in exchange for dominion. They called it the Compact, and Lillian had obtained proof. Elijah leaned closer, his voice dry. She said if she died, I had to get that paper to someone outside Hollowvale, but I was captured before I could leave. Margaret resealed the note and slipped it into her dress. Then we do it now. They knew escape wouldn't be easy. Outside, the house slept, or pretended to. The trust had eyes in every corner. The only way out was through the old tunnel Elijah had used weeks ago, one that led from the base of the vault into a dry riverbed half a mile beyond the ridge. But before they left, Margaret returned to the shelf of documents. She gathered as much as she could, the journals, the charter, the maps. She placed Lillian's body gently back into the cavity and replaced the stone panel, whispering a final promise. We'll finish what you started. Elijah, weak but standing, helped carry the bundle of documents. And so, by the dim flame of a stolen lantern, the 2 of them slipped into the narrow escape passage, leaving behind the mansion that had devoured so many truths. But as they descended into the earth, they did not know. Someone was already waiting at the end of the tunnel. The passage twisted like a serpent beneath the estate, cut through ancient shale and veins of coal, choked with the smell of wet stone. Margaret and Elijah moved in silence, their breathing shallow, each footstep echoed behind them like a warning. At the tunnel's end was a rusted grate, wedged open by a stone. Beyond it, cold night air, the whisper of wind through barren trees, and the faint glimmer of lantern light. They stepped out into the dry riverbed, moonlight revealing snow-dusted stones and the twisted remnants of roots. For a moment, freedom. Then a voice called from the trees, "Drop the bundle and the locket." 3 men emerged, dressed in wool coats dark as shadow, collars pulled high. Not deputies, not townsmen. These were enforcers, men of the Rust. Elijah backed against the rock wall, his fists clenched. Margaret stood between them and the documents. Her voice was steady. She left proof, and we're not the only ones who will see it. One of the men chuckled. "Ma'am, we've buried dozens for less. You'll be a snow-covered memory by dawn." But they had underestimated her. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out the lantern, not to light the way, but to ignite the fuse she'd soaked in oil and wrapped around the tunnel entrance 2 hours earlier. A final precaution. She struck the match. The explosion ripped through the ground behind them, hurling smoke and fire into the trees. The men scattered, coughing, blinded by debris. Margaret and Elijah ran, not toward town, but into the woods, where a horse waited tethered behind the old stone chapel. They rode through the night. By sunrise, they had crossed the county line. Within 2 days, Copies of the Ridgeline Charter and Gideon's Confession were delivered, one to a Boston newspaper, another to the office of a reformist senator in Richmond. Within weeks, there were whispers of hearings. Within months, mine inspections, arrests. But Gideon Harrow? He vanished. Highpoint was boarded up. The estate sold at auction to a timber company. The ice house was demolished. The vault collapsed. Some say Harrow fled to Argentina. Others believe the trust pulled him deeper underground, to places where no court could reach. Margaret never returned to Hollowvale. Elijah died in 1894, penniless but proud. And as for Lillian, she became a quiet martyr. No statues, no headlines, just a name passed in whispers between miners and mothers in towns built on coal and bone. The woman who dared to dig too deep and was buried for it.